Welcome to Arvid and Tyler Catch Up. I'm Arvid.
I'm Tyler. Let's catch up.
Let us catch up. I had a wonderful week. I cannot wait to hear about yours. So, how's your week been?
No, tell me about the baseball. Tell me about everything.
Yeah, I took a day off. That's probably one of the most important things. I think I wrote something on Twitter yesterday about my boss is always really nice when I ask him if I can have a day off because that is me and I
Hmm.
always allow myself to have a day off. So
Hmm.
the fact that we're recording one day late is kind of because I went to over the border. I left Canada for a couple hours and went to Detroit to see a really nice to see a really nice stadium. The game was not that exciting, but the stadium and
Mm.
the atmosphere, the crowd, and all of that was fun. Game was kind of it was a big loss for the Tigers, so I don't know, but it was an enjoyable trip. It was really cool to see. That was one of the things that I found super interesting. So you come from Windsor in Canada, you go through
Mm.
either a tunnel or you take the Ambassador Bridge, and you end up in a completely different country. It is so nice, this change between Canada and the States. Subtle, obviously, because the cultures are quite similar, but now
Mm.
you go from kilometers to miles. The signs are slightly
Mm.
different, the stores are completely different. It's just you
Hmm.
swap out one society for another, and it's just connected by a tunnel under a river. It's so cool. It was so fun to see. I was traveling with my brother-in-law and his kid, and he was like, the kid, not the brother-in-law, why are there no Canadian flags here? What's going on? Like, he was trying to figure out that it's slightly different, and he noticed
Mm.
as like 5 or 6 year old he saw that there was
Mm.
something so significantly different that he needed to shout it out, and we kind of explained to him, oh yeah, this is an actual different country, and then still, but why are there no flags? I pointed out that the American flag looks slightly different. It was just such an enjoyable little trip with the family that I was able to take in the middle of the week, which makes me really happy that I'm doing what
Mm.
I'm doing, having a media business and a SaaS business that kind of runs itself, so you can take the day off. That was
Mhm.
quite the gift to have, and it was fun to do family stuff in the middle of the week. Honestly, a baseball game around noon, that's super enjoyable. Like, it's not getting
Mm.
late, right? The sun is. It was nice. The weather was great too, and the people
Mhm.
around you are all enjoying the day in the middle of the day. It was fun. That's
Yeah.
that's my non work event for this week. Other than that, the day before, we talked about Paul Miller like for each episode over the last month. I think I finally had a recording with him. I had him on my podcast. We had a really nice conversation. He's a wonderful guy. I'm not surprised that I was always attracted to his writing and his thinking, and having a chat with him even makes that much more enjoyable because you know the person behind it. And I read his book again, like just on the day prior. I read through it one more time to have everything in my mind for the conversation. And like, the Pathless Path is a wonderful book. He writes it with
Mm.
such a lucidity, coming from his own experience. It's super well written. It shows that there is a different way for each of us. We just kind of have to understand that there is one. It was great. We
Mhm.
had a great chat. That was one of the big highlights of my week. I enjoyed that way more than the baseball game that the Tigers lost, obviously. But no, it was just really nice to talk to somebody who has understood something that I had innately understood but never could put a word to. That was one thing
Mm.
that the book and his thinking allowed me to do, is to call my life as I live it now a life on a pathless path. And I never had the vocabulary for that before. I just thought, well, I don't resonate with the default narrative. That's what we called it like a couple weeks ago here, right? With the
Yeah.
narratives that other people give us for our lives. But I didn't have a way to positively describe what I was doing. And in reading Paul's work and in talking to him about it, I found myself much more confident in being able to explain what I'm doing by having this phrase and having the framework, the concepts behind it. So that was a big thing for me, in terms of having a great
Yeah.
chat on my podcast, which I always like. And then the
Yeah.
last thing that I wanted to mention is that I'm taking more and more steps into becoming a traditionally published author. So I
Mm.
am now working on an actual book proposal with somebody who knows how to do it, and we
Okay.
are we found an agreement and are working on my third book. Or I don't know, it might take a while. It might actually be that my third book becomes my fourth book because I just decide to self-publish one in the meantime, while the actual process of writing the book that might take a couple years is happening. But the build in public book that I'm intending to write is taking more shape because the process to getting it through all the stages that a traditionally published book needs to go through is on the go. So
That's
3 days
cool.
of highly different activities
Yeah.
on Monday, Tuesday, Friday, and that's kind of what I want to talk to you about later, like juggling different projects of different
Sure.
scopes and different intensity. But first, let me know, how was your week? Let's catch up with that.
Yeah. Yeah, my week was good. I like some of the stuff you just said just now. Like, I mean, I'm excited to hear your conversation on the other podcast. I feel like it seems like almost every entrepreneurial generation needs like some sort of just like permission structure to do what they already
Yep.
want to do. I feel
Yep.
like a lot of folks maybe like slightly like our age, would have identified with like the 4 hour work week as that, as sort of like, hey, like this is just permission to go and do this weird stuff that everybody thinks is dumb and strange,
Yep.
and so that's super cool. Yeah, I had a great week. I think like so, I feel like everything kind of came together. I finally got a lot of things settled in the business, and I basically spent the last probably closing in on 2 weeks just completely focused on, the part of this business that I actually love, which is, reviewing a ton of applications for investment and then just having lots of meetings with founders, working my way through that process of, both investing in founders, but I also do enjoy the process of just speaking with them as well, even if maybe we can't necessarily invest. I think that I do try to also be a little bit of like a well-intentioned sort of sparring partner in those conversations. And I mean, you never really know when you have this kind of like investor founder dynamic whether people are being genuine with what they say in terms of their compliments. But a lot of founders will write me afterwards and say like, even though you didn't invest, like I really enjoyed the conversation because, like we sort of asked a bunch of questions that we weren't necessarily thinking about or helped us maybe see around some corners. I had someone just follow up with me from yesterday saying like, I used to think of this like other big incumbent company as a competitor, but after a couple of questions you asked, we started thinking about it and we were like, no, we think we should integrate with them. And we just reached out with them and like they're super
Right.
excited to work with us. And I was like, great. Like so that's just super fun. It's like like one of my favorite things to do. And it's funny how you get those weeks where you realize how far you had really strayed from what you really love to do in the
Yeah.
business.
Yeah,
And so
that's
this has
right.
been a great sort of reminder to just really get back into that. And then the other thing is I've had like a lot of, I was dealing with a bunch of random health things over the last couple of months. I was super sick. And then I had this weird kind of nerve issue that was not super painful and not super serious, but it was really preventing me from exercising and all this kind of stuff. And it's, it's interesting how much those things really do compound on your mood and your actual work. I think like one of the things I've learned now well enough, but I think it's you have to kind of learn the lesson the hard way is that stuff like that when you have a job like let's say like our what we both do where it's very self-directed, it's very kind of deep work centric, all that sort of stuff. Like sometimes the most important, effective, guilt-free thing you can do for yourself is like take 3 days off or go get a massage, if you have
Yep.
like, like pain and stuff, because it's just very hard to the difference between kind of like, you know, waking up and forcing yourself to try and do the work and when you're not really all like centered and you're not really feeling in the zone and all that sort of stuff versus when you are can just be like 20x. So like if it takes you 2 or 3 days to recover and then get back into the zone and really be focused, it's a totally good trade-off that you shouldn't feel guilty at all about. And I think even still, even now, I sort of feel that way, especially having like investors that I'm kind of responsible to. I'll still kind of be like, oh, should I really take today to, just focus on exercising and stretching and getting out in the sun and being healthy and all that sort of stuff. But then you do it and you come back and you're like, smash it for, 6 days in a row. And you're like, yeah, that was the right decision. So
Yeah.
I'm kind of right in the middle of that flow right now, which is feeling really good. So, yeah.
I'm glad to hear it. I'm
Yeah.
honestly like every person that I meet or that I talk to who has understood that good health, good sleep, good nutrition are actually much more relevant to your productivity than setting up a Notion template or having some kind
Yeah,
of calendar integration somewhere. Like it's
totally.
it just really shows in how much they get done in terms of not just how busy they are, but how effective they are. That
Yeah.
is really super noticeable. There's something weird about the way I was raised. I don't know if it's the same for you, but I had this conversation on Twitter earlier, which is why it's so top of mind for me. Somebody was saying, hey, sometimes I just spend an hour doing nothing and I feel extremely guilty about it because I could have worked, I could have made money. And I was like, yeah, I really resonate with this. And it took me ages to overcome the sentiment that any time not spent working is time wasted, right? Like,
Mm,
whereas this time is actually recovery time or it's like leisure, which is perfectly fine. It's fine to enjoy your
yeah.
life. You're a human being.
Yeah.
You're not a machine. You're not supposed to work 24/7, right? Or
Sure.
distraction, which allows you to be creative because it rewires your brain or it allows your brain to idle a bit so it can restart more effectively. All of these things are just as important to you getting somewhere as doing the busy work. But we have
Yeah.
conflated being busy with being productive, which obviously is not the same. And it takes such a hard amount of effort, such a high amount of effort to break this because I have been socialized with this. Like even
Mm,
today, like I saw a text from somebody in my somebody I know that was saying, "Oh yeah, your hard work paid off." It's like, yes, but is that the only thing that is related to success? That you had hard
mm,
work and you put in all the hours and you put in all the effort? It's probably also that you did it in the smart way, or you did good
mhm.
work because you applied techniques that had nothing to do with how hard and intensely you worked, but just what technique you chose, right? So there's the sentiment in where I come from and lots of people around me come from that work is time spent
Yeah.
on a thing, right?
Yeah.
And it's again Paul Millard in his book. He talks about this too. Like sorry, this is becoming the Paul Millard podcast. Let's just call it that. But it's he talks about the Protestant work ethic, the
Sure.
Protestant work ethic. That's the name of it, right?
Yep.
Where you are closer to God if you find your calling and you work on it as much as you can. I'm
Yeah.
living in Canada in a family that comes from this religious background. A lot of farmers here who have worked a lot in their life to get anywhere. So this
Yeah.
is very very clearly evident around me. I have people in my extended and close family who cannot sit still if they have the opportunity for it. They feel they
Yeah.
are, and this might not be a religious thing, but they feel they're like doing something wrong. There is a moral implication to not working, to not being or busying yourself with work, which
Yeah.
scares me coming from
Yeah.
the very lazy other end of this, right? Because I don't want to feel
Yeah.
like I'm making them uncomfortable by being comfortable not doing anything. But
Yeah.
it's such an interesting cultural thing. How do you feel about this? Do you come from a similar background there, or how
I
did you
think
get out of it?
so. Yeah, a little bit less of the kind of like, certainly not much of the religious background necessarily. Although I think what you're saying and what everybody's saying is that it's sort of like more from religious to cultural a little bit. It's sort of like it was a very religious thing, and now it's just become rooted in the culture. Yeah, I totally agree. I think, I feel like, uh, there's almost like two way stations on the way. One is getting like completely comfortable just not working, which I think is like very interesting, and a lot of people have a very difficult time with that at all. In where there's like a true trade off, where you're saying like I could work, I could be more effective, and I'm choosing not to. The kind of like middle way station along the way that I like is sort of, uh, basically building more and more leverage for yourself and in what you
Yeah.
do as work, such that you're actually not making a trade-off, right? Which
Mhm.
is where, like, as for example, like a writer or an investor, your next book, it could be 100 times better than the worst version of it, right?
Yeah.
So, like, if you decide to take 6 weeks and travel, and through that travel, you get an inspiration for a way to take the book, and that makes it 40 times better, in terms of sales or impact or whatever, that's like that's work, right? You're not
Yeah.
even slacking
Yes.
off. You're not even kind of making that trade-off. And I feel that way as well. Like I feel like when I cultivate the level of clarity and decision making, I can make investing decisions that could be 50 times better than what I might make on a random Tuesday when I'm not feeling kind of completely optimal. So that's one thing, is like if you feel that guilt, one thing you can do is just not face it directly, but like build
Yeah.
leverage such that, sharpening the saw, right? I think I posted this on Twitter, the like age old thing of, I think it's like, maybe it's Abraham Lincoln or something, but he's like, if you give me 8 hours to chop down a tree, I'm going to spend the first 6 hours sharpening the saw, right? It's like you want to do the prep work, and the more leverage you have, the more time it makes sense to sharpen the saw, right? It's not, you can't make the same argument if you're a, I don't know, what's a good example, like a customer support rep whose basic KPI is like answering the number of tickets. Yeah, okay, taking 6 weeks off is just going to be a clear trade-off. But you can move yourself along that line where you can have work that has more leverage, where this sort of leisure, health, creativity, distraction, all that kind of stuff actually does fuel your actual work. The other side, I think, is a little more like Paul's domain, to be honest. I don't know if I'm even ready to opine on just genuinely, hey, the
Hey,
value of,
it's
just taking off work for a year without without an argument to yourself for why that's going to make your next batch of work more effective. Just literally being like, I don't want to work. That's some next
yeah.
level mental game. So
Well, it's your podcast. You can opine on whatever you want, and you can have any
sure,
opinion that you
sure.
want to have. But I mean, I've been switching between very different things in my life, like for most of my life. I think I've always been kind of drawn to the path that is not laid out for me by somebody else. And
Sure.
I've met a lot of resistance along the way. I still don't know if I'm right, but that's the thing about
Mhm.
this path. You can't. This It's
Mm.
impossible for a path that nobody has walked before. You cannot be sure. That is the whole point. It's like that's
Yeah.
to me, it is at the core of entrepreneurship. Like you're doing
Yeah.
something in a specific way that nobody else has ever done exactly like this before. There have been people
Yeah.
who've tried something like this, people who are doing similar things, completely different things, but never the exact same way, which is why there's
Mhm.
always risk, which is why there's investors like yourself that allow people to still do it without fielding the risk completely themselves. Like there are the dynamics of entrepreneurship are grounded in the fact that there is no clear path, right? It's a
Mhm.
pathless path, which is why this is such a great like word analogy to me, because there is no
Sure.
predetermined thing. So hey, we can opine on anything here, and I believe honestly, most of the decisions that I made in my life on what to do next or to do for the next year have been decisions in the moment when I felt like I was ready to make a choice, any choice. Right?
Mm.
I went to university kind of on a whim because I thought, yeah, that might be interesting. Never really wanted to degree. My grandparents were happy because they were the ones kind of forcing it. They were the default path people that were telling me, you need to go to university, you need to find a good
Mm.
job, and then you find a partner, and then you build a house, and then you plant a tree, and then you die. That's kind of the idea, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's what they wanted me to do. So I said, sure, why not? University in Germany is free, and I guess that is something that is an extremely privileged thing to have. And I went
Yeah.
there and failed a couple times, dropped out multiple times, and then I kind of was pulled into the Silicon Valley world, where on a whim, on a Twitter DM, I said, "Yeah, sure, why not go and check this out?" And I went,
Mm.
and at some point I was done, and I went back home, and I said, "Yeah, why not take half a year off?" It was always this kind of let's just see what's gonna happen with me.
Mhm.
So maybe if you have a personality that can be confident in your decisions, this is very easy. If you have a lot of self
Mm.
doubt and if you have a lot of external pressure, if you come from a culture where you are supposed to be extremely obedient to your parents or to your elders, many people are coming from such cultures, and it becomes super hard not to break your own identity as a good person who trusts
Mm.
their elders and still goes their own path. So there are a lot of little problems that I personally, from my cultural background, don't have to deal with. But I can
Mm.
only suggest that you find a way of just ignoring what everybody else is saying and doing, because that is their perspective. So that's kind of how
Yeah.
I feel about this. Um, I'm glad to hear you're enjoying your work. That was one of the things in your description of your last week that I really, really resonate with, and I'm really happy about
Yeah.
for you because I can just imagine how much fun you had, like getting all these calls, doing all these conversations, having these conversations with people from probably industries that you never heard of before. I bet that
Yeah.
was always that was part of this week as well. Did you? I mean, I
Uh-huh.
know that this stuff is probably highly confidential still, but was there anything like that you completely did not expect and were surprised by in those conversations?
There always is, but I feel like I need to put it on more of a time delay than
Mm,
like the week of, because sometimes a lot of the value in these businesses are just these markets that no one has even contemplated for a while, and they kind of get a jump on that.
yeah.
But yeah, it is. I I continue to be amazed at the niches within niches within niches that are surprisingly big when you actually take a look at them. And yeah, it's fascinating. I think there was like can't remember if Patrick McKenzie, who goes by Patio 11 for folks who don't know, if he coined it himself or if someone else coined it for him. But it was like Patio 11's law is that the market for sort of small internet businesses is larger than you can possibly imagine, even when you account for Patio 11's law. Basically, just like sort of infinitely regressively, sort of heap vast, full of opportunities that you just can't even fathom. So yeah, it is. It's always the best part of the job is to just be like, wow, I never even thought of this. And you've built a pretty big business in this space, or at least you've made a case that you could.
Mm.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I'm that is what always what I always found amazing about you and what you write about in your updates that you give to investors and
Yeah.
stuff. Like it's just the the crazy markets that people are in
Yeah.
that make good money and that they actually solve people's problems and make the market better that
Yeah.
just did not exist in your mind, in your conception of the world before. That just blows
Yeah.
my mind every time. And it would be
Yeah.
nice to be able to give examples here, but we can't, obviously. Like so, just imagine that there's something out there that you cannot imagine. But it's
Yeah.
just this super hyper specific markets there.
It is very cool. I mean, the one challenging thing that is sort of, I guess maybe I'll take a moment to talk about it here is making sure that people right size the amount of capital that they raise
Mm,
relative to these very, very cool niches. We've just kind of come out of this cycle where money was just everywhere and people could get all sorts of like local venture funds or a
mhm,
random group of angels and stuff like that to give you whatever, like $2 million at a 10 or 15 or 20 million dollar valuation, and you can build like all these amazing businesses in all these cool niches, but you can't once you do that sort of thing, because now you have to build a business that's worth at least 150 million dollars for the whole thing to make sense. And you've cornered yourself into, well, now this is, I could have built a great 10, 20, $50 million business, but this market's just really not big enough to build a $200 million business. And now I'm going to have to make all kinds of changes to my business plan. I'm going to have to be much more quote unquote ambitious, right? In the sense of, we're not just going to take on this market that we found. We're going to take on the, umbrella market that of, the whole thing. We're going to take over the whole market now. And you end up basically kind of backing yourself into this high risk, opportunity that wasn't your original idea. And I'm seeing a lot of that as I'm talking to founders, is that they heard about what people were raising money for some AI startup, and so they've raised at some crazy high valuation, and they use that money to kind of like ramp up their team, and so they've got 12 people on staff, even though they only have $10,000 a month in revenue, so they're burning a lot of money and all this kind of stuff. And I'm having to sort of have a bunch of conversations with founders to try and help them kind of like make a hard downshift, right? To say like, stick to the original plan. Probably you can't keep this whole team. Probably you can't raise, as much money as at high valuation. You still have a very good idea if you want to downshift and cut your costs, stick to the original plan, and grow your revenue. But that's really hard to do once you kind of like rev that engine up to whatever sixth gear, to then slow it back down to third, to use a bad manual car analogy that I don't really know because I don't drive a manual car, but you know what I'm saying? Like, to really kind of change the whole flow and inertia of the business is really hard to do. So that's kind of one of the challenges I'm facing right now, is talking to founders and also trying to make sure that founders don't still now get themselves in that position right now that we know kind of the market is different. So um, anyway, that's something I'm
Uh,
dealing with, but yeah.
yeah, how do founders react to this? Like, what's there's probably like a visceral response when you tell them that this is probably not the best idea, right?
Yeah, it takes a while to sink in. I mean, founders are fundamentally kind of like a little bit naively optimistic, right? That's kind of one of the things that you kind of have to be an entrepreneur, is like a overconfidence in your own capacity to surmount challenges, right? That's like, because like, a lot of businesses fail. Why would you do it if you knew like a lot of them fail? So
Right.
you kind of run into a bit of that, really, where it's like, well, I understand what you're saying about the market, but like, we are going to be the ones, the outliers, right? We're going to be the ones that still, manage to navigate this effectively. I mean, honestly, a lot of founders are pretty receptive to it. It's just, even if you're receptive to the idea, it's very hard to implement, right? It's hard to have just grown your team from 3 to
Uh-huh.
12 and then have to cut half of them to get back on it, while still having cash in the bank, right? You could keep these
Yeah.
people on, but the trajectory is off, right? You're
Yeah.
not gonna get to break even before your cash runs out. So what you need to do is change the angle of that whole formula. And
Yeah.
so you've like just hired these people in the last 6 months, and then you have to be like, well, the market changed. We don't think there's a good chance we're going to be able to raise $6 million in 12 months. We think maybe we might be able to raise 1 million or maybe nothing. So we need to change that curve. And it's just hard, even if you know it, it's really hard for founders to kind of like, it feels like you're admitting failure right out of the gate. You're just off the
Yeah.
starting line. There's just a lot of kind of pressures. So one of the things I try to do as an investor is to kind of play like part therapist a little bit, right? Like, sort of like, A, help them walk through that, and then B, also I am able to kind of be the bad cop in the situation a little bit, to be like, look, you can kind of like you can kind of use me as the rationale, right? Like, we want to invest, but we came with these kind of like conditions, right? Which is like, we wanted to bring on these new investors, but they strongly encouraged us to do X, Y, and Z. And that kind of like sometimes helps founders navigate that a little bit. But I mean, I know it's really, really tough to
Yeah.
to actually execute that plan. But this is why I kind of created all this like terminology around like, be long-term ambitious, right? Because it feels like you're curbing your ambition in the short term, right? It feels like kind of giving up on the dream by 40%, or something. But it's not. It's more about like making sure that you are still around 10 years from now working on this thing, versus the whole company shuts down in 18 months, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
That does remind me. I had a conversation earlier with a friend, and he runs a SaaS business. He is a writer, and he has a newsletter. He runs a couple things at the same time. And
Mhm.
he was just wondering how to deal with priorities, right? We were talking
Yeah.
about like what should we prioritize. That's kind of the
Hmm.
the thing I want to talk about today, is kind of splitting your time and attention between things. And this conversation really brought it into sharp relief for me, because the SaaS business that he's running is a successful business. It has a, like mid 5-figure monthly recurring revenue. It's great.
Hmm.
And it's just a bit on the back burner because he's been writing more in the past, right? He's
Hmm.
juggling that, and his newsletter is picking up, and he's getting a lot of leads through to his work, and there's a lot of interconnectivity between these things, but priority is always a shifting goal, right? You never know, like, should I spend this day on the SaaS building a new feature, or should I spend it writing, creating this new amazing piece of content that may or may not trickle in a couple of sales later down the line, or should I do a sales call with a couple of enterprise customers that might bring in a significant amount of revenue? So there's always this, and I found that kind of hard to even give advice, because I
Yeah.
myself struggle with this, I think it's
Mm,
obviously like this whole podcast came to be because we have a project that we want to do together that is still not our main priority in anything we do. The Com MBA is something that gets little updates every now and then, but it's never
mm,
something that gets like a full weeks of attention until we actually
mm-hmm.
do it, which is something that we should talk about today as well. But the what I found was you have these many small bets, which is what Daniel Vassallo calls it, like the approach of like hedging your risk by having many small different things, and if one breaks away you still have others, and particularly when those things are interconnected with each other there is an increased value, right? The sum of the parts is what was the phrase, the whole thing is bigger than the sum of its parts, or some
Yeah.
there's some interconnectedness, some network effect between those tools. And
Yeah.
I found that it does not really allow you to stay super calm if you need to constantly shift your priorities, right? Because there's context switching in there. There's seeing potential. That's kind of why we chatted, because he was saying if I just spend a lot of time on the SaaS right now, this could be the big break because it is already super profitable, and with more attention to detail, with more engagement with the customer base, this could easily double and triple, which might then be an exit in the 7, 8 figures, whatever it may be, which shifts your whole life. Having
Yeah.
done this myself, right? That this shifts everything that you do. You become a you think differently. You have this post-economic state of mind where you don't look at am I going to make tomorrow, but what is going to happen 10 years from now. And you were just
Right.
talking about this long-term ambition, and in a
Yeah.
way, the SaaS business is a short-term ambition, right? If you ramp it up over
Mhm.
the next couple of years, exit it, and then you're done. At least that is the optimal space. But if you have a new startup, if you're building a personal brand around your knowledge in a particular space, if you're
Mhm.
writing books, all of these things are long-term projects. They're infinite games, right? You play the
Right.
game to stay in it, and with knowledge, with teaching, you want your personal brand to help others to then for them to come back a couple of years in the future and say, hey, that this person helped me out, you should look at their work, right? This is an infinite long-term aspiration. So yeah, what do we do? Do we look at the short-term gains that could potentially level us up? Or do we look for multiple different things at the same time? Do we tunnel vision on the short-term thing to later be able to go for the infinite things? Or do we all try to keep those things at the same time? Do you have an approach for this in all the different projects that you have? Like, how do you prioritize which goes first and how much attention you spend on each of these things?
Yeah. I think there's a couple like layers to the onion here that we can approach. One, I think is just I have a meta comment about how to think about this. I think the other one is just how to set priorities, period. And then the other one would be how to prioritize across multiple projects, things like that. So um maybe we'll just like go layer by layer. But I think
Sure.
the highest level thing that I think is important to remember and that I remind myself of all the time and that I'm constantly reminding founders of is, this is an example of the oh, what is it? There's a uh the explore versus exploit problem,
Mhm.
the one armed bandit problem, or the many armed bandit problem, right? There's like a computer science version of this, but basically the fundamental question is like, do I, keep doubling down and spending my time, energy, money, bets, etc., on something that I know is working, versus take a gamble and try to find something else that's going to work better? And you can break that down. It does not even have to be across projects, right? It can be mini projects within the different businesses, right? So it might be, do I keep doubling down on, this customer acquisition strategy for the SaaS, or do I take 4 weeks off and try to write an ebook, for the course or something like that, right? These are all versions of the same thing. You either double down on what's working, or you do something fundamentally uncertain and see if it has, some better upside. And at the end of the day, I think there is a computer science solution to this in like a very constrained version. But when you kind of make it more of a philosophical problem, I think the answer is nobody knows. And so, like, don't worry about trying to figure it out, basically. That, like, it's actually fundamentally completely impossible to figure out an answer to this sort of thing. And every entrepreneur, everybody who doesn't work a sort of job, basically, is faced with this problem. And you really just have to, like, not get caught in loop after loop after loop of trying to create some solution. You just have to figure out a way to, like, a decision making framework to just sort of make some bets and try to survive those bets and, figure out how to kind of double down on the ones that work or, run back the stuff that doesn't. But I think the number one thing is just not to get completely caught up in stressing about this sort of thing, because it's just unknowable, right? There is no amount of like sitting down on a sheet of paper or with a whiteboard or just like beating your head against the wall that's going to like push out an answer for you for this general type of decision making. I'm curious if that resonates for you, and then like how do you think about like, I don't know, do you have a decision making framework for this that you kind of stick to, like a simple rule of thumb or anything like that?
What I suggested to him in response to having that problem, the exact same problem you just mentioned, like not being able to
Mhm.
figure it out clearly, was to just try a version of it for a couple weeks. That's what I
Yeah.
said. Like if you wanna see if you enjoy building your SaaS for 4 days a week, do 4 days a week for a month, and like write down today what you think you will have to accomplish for this to be valuable. Like put your
Yep.
expectations down. Put your expectations down as to what you think you can do. Do it for
Hmm.
a month, and then check back in with yourself and see if those 4 weeks worked for you, and just evaluate. It's kind of the typical SaaS founder iteration thing, right? You build something, you put it out, you see what feedback comes back in, you change it, you put it back out. Like it's the whole, and that's what building in public is effectively, a feedback cycle that is just done in public. And you can do this in public or in private, whatever for your business doesn't really matter, as long as you keep iterating and checking
Hmm.
back in with your expectations, and kind of mix and match what works for you and what doesn't. Because it might be that he does not enjoy working on this, the technical part of the SaaS as much now that he has started writing so much, right? Because maybe that's my experience. I loved coding, like that was my whole life, and then I
Mm.
started writing. And now I figured out,
Mm.
ooh, coding was just really writing for machines. And machines tend to be pretty dumb. People are great. They give me a lot of thoughts. Machines do not. I mean, unless it's ChatGPT, but that has kind of mixed it all up again. But like
Yeah.
writing to me for people feels so much more fulfilling even than building something really cool with code. That's kind of where my
Mm.
personality of just wanting to please people. I'm a people pleaser, and writing allows me to do this much more than just solving a technical problem somewhere. So
Hmm.
it gravitates towards that. So maybe he will figure out, who I've been working 4 days a week on this. I don't enjoy it as much as I used to before I
Yeah.
started my newsletter, right? So,
Yeah.
but he will never be able to know until he tried. So I think experimentation, just like you said, like iteration, time boxed experimentation is the best way to deal with this, because there is no way to figure it out other than by creating your own anecdote to look back into, right? You need your empirical, anecdotal, personal data to then make choices from. That is my suggestion. My suggestion is just to try stuff, which is
Yeah.
again quite privileged, I guess, because you have to be able to take 4 days to work on this, right? If your income is dependent on you working a full-time job and then have a side project that you want to get going, this which is what
Yeah.
most people who follow the many small bets approach are trying to do. Well, you don't have that much time. You cannot just spend like 4 days a week on your side project, because that turns it into a main project, right? There are always going to be constraints, but within the constraints, there is a lot of room for experimentation. And
Yeah.
particularly when you still have a job, when you're not out of the 9 to 5 world, everything outside of your job can be an experiment. Might just as well treat it like this, right? This doesn't
Mhm.
have to immediately work. You can see if a version of it works better, or if something else works better completely. I think that is the idea, is to experiment. But again, within a time constrained way, because otherwise you're just gonna follow this the rabbit hole situation forever, and you never get to any kind of meaningful data that you can infer a decision from. That's
Yeah.
that's what how I approach it.
I totally agree with that. I think the way that I summarize that is like kind of just try to find the smallest possible experiment, right? So this is a little bit of version of like the minimum viable product kind of approach from the lean startup and stuff, which is try to take the essence of what the big bet would be and try to make it smaller, and then see if that fits within your constraints. And you're right, some people might have very extreme constraints. They might say, I've got a bunch of kids, I've got a job, I've got a side project already, but I want to try and see if this other thing is worth doubling down on. I have 1 hour per week, or something. Okay, cool. Like just try and keep distilling and distilling and distilling the experiment down to where you're still kind of testing the idea. Maybe you're like, I want to write a book. Well, start with, I'm going to tweet about it. I'm going
Yeah.
to like create an
Yeah, that's
account and
right.
I'm going to schedule 5 tweets for the week in my 1 hour and I'm going to see if they
Yeah.
resonate, right? Like just keep distilling it
This,
down. And then the second thing
this
of a piece of that is something you touched on, which is making it reversible, right? So this is like I think I think Patrick Collison gets credit for this in my mental library of like basically he said something like, if a decision is easily reversible, then you should be making it much, much, much faster than you normally are, right? If it can be reversed easily, like you don't need to wait for 100% confidence on the right decision. You should go with like 40% confidence and just
mhm.
go with it. But I think that applies to this too, which is you make these bets if they are pretty easily reversible. So a non-reversible decision would be I'm shutting down the SaaS to go all in
Yeah.
on my newsletter, right?
Quitting my
Very
job, right?
reversible. Yeah, quitting my job, right? Try to avoid those things and try to find very reversible kind of things where you could say, that didn't really work out. And the consequences of dialing that back is pretty much minimal. Yeah.
So you're effectively de-risking your choices there, right? Like a reversible
Yeah.
decision is by nature less risky than an
Right.
irreversible one. So that
Right.
sounds like we're getting into calm business territory, right? Like to de-risking even important choices like this, that it
Mm-hmm.
creates way less anxiety with you, and like not just you. Like I'm thinking most of these people who have trouble with this priority stuff are people who have no team, are solopreneurs, people who are just running a
Mm-hmm.
very an elaborate thing, an elaborate mix of things all by themselves. Because the moment you have a team, you can kind of split up responsibilities and you can run
Yeah.
your own experiments, they can run theirs, but the reversibility is kind of built in because everybody has their field and they have an overview over what's happening, what the goals are, and what their work should be about. But if
Sure.
all of this happens in you, it gets like it's a lot. You juggle a lot, and you have less time and less energy for other things. Which I'm just thinking, and this is completely I'm not off topic, but it's very it's just adjacent to it. You need somebody in your life that supports that approach to like structuring your life. If you have a
Mm.
partner, right, or if you have a support network, you need people who tell you, sure, do this experiment if it's reversible. Like you need us as your friends. That's what I'm trying to say, right? You need people who give you permission, and that's kind of what we started this conversation with today. Permission to try stuff out without telling you, "Ooh, that's risky," and "Oh, you should probably better get a job," or "Oh no, that we can't do that." Like, those people, they are not gonna help you with this. Like you need to surround yourself with people who first still are sensible about this, but also understand that for somebody like you who is an entrepreneur, you need to
Mm.
be allowed to run your experiments that may be slightly risky, but have an like long-term payoff that is visible to you. You're not just running random experiments. You're running some that have this kind of inkling of a potential payoff later down the road. What I'm trying to say
Yeah.
is you need to make sure that people around you or people that you surround yourself with are supportive of this approach to life. Because if you find somebody who is very much on the default path of just compliance and de-risking everything by not doing it at all, then you're gonna have trouble as a founder to keep that momentum, right? Because you need to, some of these things, most of them probably will not work out. And you need somebody who's going to say, okay, try the other thing, instead of telling you, see, told you it wasn't going to work. That person is not going to help you in that moment. Lots of people are like this. I'm saying this not because I'm better or anything, but I had this in my family. My family has been extremely suppressive of entrepreneurial work my whole life because they just
Mm.
could not understand how I didn't want to get a job, right? And the funny part is, like, there was an entrepreneurial side to this. Like, part of my grandparents, they ran their own business, but they ran it
Mm.
after they had a full life of work. It was kind of their
Mm.
retirement activity. They didn't
Mm.
consider that this might be actually like a lifelong thing that you could do. It was just something
Yeah.
they found after they were done working. It's sorry for bringing all of this in here, but it's just I've talked to so many people over the last couple of weeks who are kind of suppressed by the same forces in their lives, that I just want to tell them, hey, if the people around you are not supportive of this, you might want to find other people who are. Not
Yeah.
don't push away the old ones, but add new ones to your circle who are as supportive as we are trying to be here on this
Yeah.
podcast.
I think that's true. I think you can also, I mean, I think like yes and to that, basically, you should definitely do that. And then also just cultivate that conviction within yourself as well, right? You know, in the sense that, I mean, I was thinking about this recently about how like how difficult it can be sometimes to when you are like the right approach, for example, in almost all cases is to experiment, right? To try things that might fail, right? Almost certainly the wrong approach is, you know, over some long period of time, like never try any of these experiments, right?
Mhm.
So you're doing this and you're trying a bunch of experiments that fail, and sometimes a bunch of them fail, right? And you're like, man, like I had all this momentum going back when I first started this thing. Everything kind of
Mhm.
seemed to go right. You know, I'd post my MRR growth on Twitter and everybody would high five me and blah, blah, blah. And now I'm experimenting, and now I've got, you know, 4 out of the last 5 are kind of like failures. And yeah, they were small and yeah, they were reversible, but it's like, man, I really, you know, feel like I'm kind of off the path here. And just kind of like, yes, it's important to have people around you that will say that, but also you kind of just have to cultivate that conviction in yourself that, you know, almost always the right thing to do is to keep trying stuff and keep iterating and keep experimenting. You know, I often think about it as like, um, you know, I've been talking a lot to people who are kind of at the earliest phases of entrepreneurship lately, like people in my life and friends and friends of friends and stuff. And I kind of think like most entrepreneurs that get their first start, they kind of get this conviction to do something, and then they don't just like come right out of the gate with like this idea that's going to work. They get this sense that they need to do their own thing, and they just
Yeah.
start pushing, and they're kind of
Yeah.
pushing an idea here and it doesn't really go, and they push an idea here, it doesn't really go, and they push this idea and it just goes, you know, and then they're
Mhm.
like, oh, this is what we're doing now. You
Yeah.
know, but it's
Yeah,
just
that
like
makes
getting
sense.
that conviction to start pressing on the edges of things and saying like, okay, could this be the one? No, could this be the,
Yeah.
oh, this is the one, you know.
Yeah,
And just like
it
keeping
does.
that conviction. Yeah.
It
Go
does
ahead.
remind me of fishing, like the act of
Ah,
fishing,
yeah,
because
yeah,
you
yeah.
you 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 put up like the rod as well as you can, and you have your little lure or whatever. You throw it in, and you see if something nibbles. Like you don't expect the bite, right? The bite would be great because then you can just reel out the fish and you have dinner or something. But most of the time, that's just a little nibble. And like
Mm,
whoever would not try to throw at the exact same location and see if there's more nibble, right? You
mm,
wouldn't, oh yeah, there's a nibble, let's just go somewhere else. That doesn't happen, right? So you figure out, okay, this point of the lake or the river I'm fishing in, that's where something is happening. So I'm just gonna
mm,
try another lure and throw it in and see if that brings it out. Or I'm trying to move the rod slightly differently to attract another, like the fish in a different way, because every single fish responds to different behavior in terms of the prey that they hunt, right? Or the kind of stuff that they eat. So you kind of you get like the area which is interesting to you, and then you throw back in. And if you throw
mm,
into an area and nothing happens for an hour, well, maybe you should look for a different area to throw your lure in, right? Fishing has a lot of and there's a whole other layer there too. Like sometimes you just have to fish for a couple hours and reel it back in, throw it back out, nothing happens, reel it back in, but you don't stop reeling it back in. Like that is part of the process, is to see if something happens on the way. Right? Even on the way back in, if you're like winding down whatever idea you have, somebody might happen to tell you something that you completely forgot. There was a Twitter conversation I was in recently where somebody was describing how one of their projects didn't work out, and in the comments to that were, well, I understand you tried this and that, but there's this other market that this would be perfect for. Have you ever considered talking to people in that market? And that person hadn't. And now they are. Like they were winding down their project, thinking it had failed
mm,
in public. And through the conversation around the process of winding down, they found a potential market that it might actually succeed in. So, with the
mm.
fishing
So
analogy,
cool.
you're already reeling it back in because it didn't work. But on the way, there's this tiny little fish that comes in and is like, maybe that, nope, right? That's how it happens. So I'm just trying to say there is some endurance in all this, right? The experiments
Yeah,
often won't work, and often you will cast and you will reel back in, and nothing will happen. So maybe the worm is even falling off the lure along the way. Doesn't matter,
yeah,
right? You put it on another worm or whatever, and you throw it back out, and you get it back
yeah.
in, and that's the repetition makes it happen. That's what I'm trying to say. I have a lot of fishing metaphor, even though I'm really bad at it. But I think that those metaphors to me make a lot of sense because they connect to us on a deeply human way. Like the way we hunt for
Mm,
food, or we used to hunt, is not much different from how we go about other opportunities. it is very similar. You have to try a lot, you have to try different things, and you have to
Yep,
double down on the things that work and alternate when things don't.
I agree.
What do you think?
Yeah. And I also
Sure.
think like, I think there's something else I think is useful. So I love I think maybe Peter Levels gets credit for doing this the first that I ever saw it, like listing out all of the projects that he's ever built in some text
Yeah.
file. And it's just like some insane list of things, like 80
Yes.
something businesses that he's launched, and like four of them have ever
Yeah.
generated any meaningful amount of money to him, and probably, two represent like 95% or something like that. And
That's right.
you see that, and sometimes I'll catch even myself, right? And there's this tendency to, like, if you string together a couple of experiments that don't work, to think like, oh, everybody's really keeping score, right? They know, oh man, he's on a losing streak, 3 experiments in a row didn't work out. Everybody's waiting. They're all watching. Oh man, he's going downhill. Their opinion of him is like completely falling off a cliff. They're not going to support his next project because he's 0 for 3 of the last ones, blah, 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 blah. And you realize, like, I mean, I've been following Peter building all these
Yeah.
projects. I had no clue about like 95% of these things.
Mhm.
And they launched them, they didn't work out, like, and he does it all in public. And like, I could have probably noticed it if I'd paid attention. People are just not paying attention to this stuff,
Yeah.
and just kind of
Yeah.
like looking at something like that and remembering that nobody cares, really. Nobody is tracking, if these things don't work. So just keep trying them, I think, and
Yeah.
just kind of like cultivating a little bit of immunity to that self-doubt, I think, is important, right? If we tried 12 different experiments for the Calm MBA and the first 11 of them didn't work, like,
Yes.
nobody's going to care. You
And
know?
thanks for bringing this up, because that's the thing I really wanted to talk to you about today. And in closing this, I guess we're getting
Mhm.
getting ever closer to the hour again, once again. I think that's
Our
exactly what we
podcast
should be
can go
doing.
as long as we want.
That's right.
Sorry.
We have all the time we want. We can talk about, we can opine and delay as much as we like. I think we should, like, with the Calm NBA being something that we've been like passing back and forth and not really knowing like what's the scope and what do we need to do. Honestly, I thought about it. I gave myself some time to reflect. I did not work for an hour. I just thought, and I was like,
Mm,
the best thing we could probably do is to find a couple of candidates, maybe 5 or 6, 7, 8 candidates that want to do this thing with us. And then just start. Just have a set date, do it for a month or 2 months, like maybe 4 or 8 weeks of just regularly checking in with each other, setting up maybe a Discord or something where people can congregate and ask questions, and just take the first session as we are finding out what you guys need together. Instead of
great.
coming up with a curriculum pre-session, we come up with the curriculum after the session, because we get to the point where people tell us where they are, what they need. We structure the curriculum as we go. It's going to be an experiment anyway, right? Because it has to be, because we've never done it before. We might
Hmm.
just as well lean into the highly experimental nature of this, make it free for them, obviously, because they are part of an experiment. This is something that I wouldn't want anybody to pay for necessarily. Just find the right volunteers, I guess, for this together, and
Hmm.
just commit to between 4 and 8 sessions on a weekly basis. Determine when we would do this. We talked about maybe doing it on the weekend. Maybe this is a Friday night activity or something like that. We can get to the details of this during this conversation. But I think for the first run, let's just wing it in a way that involves the people who need it. Like, actually cater this, the white glove stuff that Paul Graham talks about when he, in his like things that
Yeah.
don't scale essay, right? That's just do the things that people need right now and figure out how to generalize it at a later point.
So basically, do we need just like a simple kind of like survey slash application form that's just like,
I think so.
yeah, tell us if you're interested, tell us what you're thinking about working on. Maybe we just ask certain things like, what's your availability? What stage are you at? Have you
Yeah.
made a prototype? Are you just pure idea stage? That sort of thing. And
Yeah.
then we just see what comes back, and then we structure
Yeah.
the first one around that.
I think so. And honestly, and since we have this podcast, might just as well ask the people listening to this podcast who might be at whatever stage they think it might be interesting for us to help them with their own building a calm SaaS business journey. Just reach out to us. Like, we are on Twitter, both of us. We have DMs open. I
Yeah.
think like you can. We definitely should do the little sign up form for us to be able to have this in an easily accessible list. But if you listener, dear listener, if you're listening to this and thinking I must be part of this experiment, because honestly it's going to be cool. Like, we're going to have amazing conversations. We're going to give exactly precise and useful and actionable information for you at any stage of your business right now. Why wouldn't you join? Tell us.
Yeah.
Like, reach out to me on Twitter, Arvid Kahl, reach out to Tyler on Twitter, Tyler Tringus. Like, we can find a way to do this together, and we figure out a good day, we figure out a good time, and then just take it for a month or two. Do it as the first cohort, the first batch. You get a nice little fake degree at the end. All of this, we can make that happen. But I just want it to be as experimental as possible, because I think we could do so much. We could spend months building up a curriculum, but why would we need to if we can just do it like 1 week at a time?
I like it. Let's do it. Yeah. Okay.
Cool. Nice. So that is, I guess, our thing for next week, is to have the sign up thing ready. Let's see what happens first. The sign up form goes up first. Who do you want to do that? Do you want to like put up a little form to capture that
Sure.
stuff? I think out of the two of us, you're the form builder. At least I hope you have some more experience than I do, because I have zero experience. I do have a Reform account, I think, but that's it. Yeah, I think that would be wonderful. And again, listeners, viewers, and transcript readers, if you're interested in this, just reach out to us on Twitter. I don't think we. Oh yeah, the Catch Up FM is our Twitter handle for this podcast. You can DM that as well. I think DMs might be open there for all our 28 followers for that account. Yeah, cool. Is there anything else you want to talk about today in this here fine conversation?
I think I just want to tie things a little bit together, where I think the two topics we were talking about connect really well, which is this prioritization across a bunch of projects, especially, for example, like the Calm MBA, as well as the kind of sharpening the saw. I think they're very, very related. You were sort of mentioning how like sometimes like the key to productivity is not, calendar automations and Notion structures and stuff like that. It's just like getting good sleep and having good nutrition. I think also that's kind of the answer to this prioritizing across a bunch of projects, is sometimes it's just building the mental capacity to tackle the big project. Especially when you have a bunch of projects, it's easy to work only on the kind of meaningless busy work version when you're tired, when you're not feeling like fully motivated and full of energy. And when you are in that state, you don't really have this agonizing thing. You just like tackle the most important thing right out of the gate and you just go for it. And everybody's kind of familiar with that sense of flow. So like cultivating that is also probably the answer to the how do you balance across multiple projects, is just like get your mind and body and energy levels correct, and it just kind of takes care of itself, which is how I feel you and I probably haven't been, specifically me mainly, but a little bit both of us in combination. And and I think we are. So like that this also might be a good case study of just get things sorted out and feel like your energy level is good, and all of a sudden things start rolling with it. So I'm excited for the next couple of weeks, next couple of months. Maybe we throw in a Arvid Comes to New York City meetup at some point.
I would love that.
I would love to do that.
I would. I honestly, I think I know a lot of people in New York City now. Like obviously you, but a lot of other really cool founders. I would be excited just to be in that place. I've never been there. And I think that is a mistake. I should correct that. Yeah, that would be cool. I mean, that could be the crowning end of this whole, or start even if we wanted to, of this whole activity, right? It's like to allow people to have a meetup. Would have to be hybrid kind of, but we can figure this out in the end. I really like this. That's cool. Also, thank you for kind of pulling this together. I think we all completely overestimate what we can do in front of a computer and very much underestimate what we can do in the kitchen or in our beds, right? Like the for ourselves and for our practical life. And another thing that I want to add, because just prior to this conversation, I was walking with my puppy because it's morning and puppy needs to walk. I have learned from my dog that having a structured life, that having some semblance of a structure in your life is extremely, it's just healthy. It just gives you points in your life that allow you to know, oh, it's time for this now, right? When she wakes up in the morning, it's time for food, and then it's time for a walk. And if we don't walk, she's like, why? It's time for a walk, right? Like, and it feels the same for me. Like Monday is my writing day. If I don't write on Monday, I feel like something is off. And this has been cultivated. I've cultivated that over the last years. Monday I write, right? So every Monday, I was talking about this earlier on Twitter, and it's gonna earlier this week, I wrote, it's Monday and it's my writing day and I love this. I'm looking forward to today. And most people responding were saying, wow, you kind of hacked life. Most people hate Mondays because they have to go to work, because they don't want to do this. But you made the thing that you like the most, the thing you look forward to when a new week starts. And I think that is something that can also be like not a cheat code, but a way to deal with your prioritization problem, is to make the fun thing the thing you start out with, like to structure your all your projects in a way that the fun is never missing from your work. Right? It's always in there. It's always, oh yeah, you see, I'm doing something impactful here. This is meaningful. This is helping people. This is giving me energy for the other things that may be more hidden, maybe more background stuff, right? I need to do admin for my business. I need to file my taxes. Not fun, but it's part of, oh yeah, I do this, and then I get to do the enjoyable thing again. It's like with my puppy. Now she's napping while we're having this conversation, knowing that once we're done, I get to play with her. So, it's a mix of fun and recovery and all these things. I think just structure is a big part. And I've structured my work week a lot over the last couple of years. I have specific days for specific things, and it has really helped me at least a little bit juggle with the priorities between all these things and keep all the things going at the same time. So
I think we need to have another conversation on this, actually, because I have a very different approach to structure.
Interesting.
So this is a topic for another podcast, actually. Let's write it down.
Please. Yeah, let's put that in the Notion doc that we have for this, because Notion is a solution to all possible problems. For next week or a week after, that would be a great chat, because I've developed this over time. Like for this particular activity I'm doing, before that was way different. So I would love to go
structure versus spontaneity.
Yes.
I'll leave it
or there. Like structuring spontaneity. That's also going to be an interesting one. Well, cool. Let's tie this up with a bow. If you enjoyed our conversation today, which I did, and I think, Tyler, you did as well. But dear listener, again, if you like this conversation, we would really like your support. This podcast is very easy to support. Tell your friends. That's the only thing that makes a big difference. We are on Twitter at CatchUpFM, but you can also just highlight our individual Twitter accounts. We do have a way for you to very easily rate and review this show by going to ratethispodcast.catchup, like CATCHUP, right? It's just very simple, and you'll find links to like the Spotify thing and Apple Podcasts. If you want to give us a really nice 5-star rating, please go there. If you want to give us anything below 5 stars, tell us on Twitter, send us a DM. That would work the best, because the idea is to just expose more people who can really use this podcast, right, to the podcast, and that is best done with a 5-star rating and a review. We would be very grateful for that. And I think it would be nice. It's always nice to see that you're listening and that you think it's worth listening to what we're doing. And with that, thank you so much for sharing your updates for this week and having a really cool conversation with me, Tyler. That was a lot of fun.
See you next week.
We see you next week.
Oh, sorry, I stole your line.